welcome to Mission 150, the podcast that tells stories from 150 years of Adventist mission to the world. To find out more about the mission of the Adventist Church today, go to adventistmission.org. That's adventistmission.org. We're so glad that you've joined us again on Mission 150. I'm David Trim.
And I am Sam Nevis. Thank you for joining us. David, today we're going to be talking about one of the most significant events in our denomination's history, the 1901 reorganization of the church.
Yes.
Now, for those that understand what happened, it's pretty exciting, but for everyone else, it's kind of boring. What happened?
So, yes, on the face of it, it could sound boring because basically the church restructured, which, be still my beating heart. It's hard not to get excited about that, right? But the key thing is the church didn't just reorganize because it wanted to achieve a more perfect organizational model. They weren't going to business schools, which didn't exist at the time anyway, and saying, what's the perfect organizational chart look like? They realized that they had a problem, that the organization that they had set up within 1863, which worked for a church that was almost entirely in the Midwest of the United States, no longer worked for a church that was already had an organized presence on several continents and which aspired to have a large presence on every inhabited continent.
My immediate response to this is they did not wait to reorganize the church in 74 when they sent the missionaries, the first missionary.
Yes.
So sometimes we have to see all the different possibilities, and until the project can see all of it, we don't start. They didn't have that approach. The next step is to send a missionary out. Okay, good. Then, in the next 20 years, they try their best to use the structure that they had set in 63 to match it, but it was not successful. No one
works at first, but once they start to spread and you get vast distances and you get Adventism growing in regions around the world, when it's just Switzerland, okay, you can work with that. But once you've actually got a presence in South Africa and then in Australia, but different states of Australia and different countries of Europe, once you have a significant presence in Switzerland and then it spreads to Germany and it's in Scandinavia and it's in Britain, there's a need to have some kind of regional organization. But instead, they still have every organized conference, and they start to organize them, and by 1901 they have organized conferences in Europe, Africa, and Australia. They have missionaries present in other continents or other parts of the regions of the world, but that's where they have organized conferences. But they all have to refer back to Battle Creek. And this is in an era when, and we touched on this in the last episode, it could take months to send a request for instructions or advice and to get a reply.
There were two main problems that we discussed in the last episode. You just mentioned one of them. The other is that the different legal entities they created were duplicating services. No one quite knew exactly where to go for what. And they were also competing with each other, therefore. And it was ineffective.
Right. The church had evolved a system of organization, which if you'd said to them in 1863, this is where you're going to be in 1901, they wouldn't have chosen that model. But of course they didn't know. They didn't know how the future was going to unfold. They knew how prophetic time was going to unfold, but they didn't know how their history was going to unfold. And so this structure just evolved by which you have independent societies and associations, which were actually separate legal corporations, requiring their own boards, their own annual general meetings. And just to make it even more complicated, the International Tract and Missionary Society had its own member societies. There were tract and missionary societies or tract societies in most Adventist states, but those were legally separate from the conference in which they operated. The Medical, Missionary and Benevolent Association, which pushed forwards the health work, again, there were separate medical, missionary and benevolent associations in many American states, as well as in Australia and in other parts of the world. So it wasn't just at the top level, but at every level you had this bifurcation, this duplication of resources, and an inability to coordinate and act really collaboratively. I mean, it wasn't impossible because many of the same people sat on the boards of these different institutions and these different associations and societies and so forth. But still, nevertheless, you did have separate teams, and they all had to relate to their component entities, the member associations or member societies. I mean, it's just a model of organization that is hopelessly complex for such a small movement.
At some point, just like individuals realize I'm in a crisis, I need to change, organizations do not change unless they face some kind of crisis. And as far as I understand, and correct me if I'm wrong, they realize, hold on a minute, we have this mission, but what got us here will most certainly not get us there. And then they decided, okay, it's time to do that.
That's the realization, and it begins to set in the 1890s. And as we touched on in the last episode, the 1890s sees mission expansion stall. The growth that had been very steady begins to decline.
Taper off.
To taper off, yes. The church continued to grow. It didn't shrink, but people could see the growing pain. People could feel the growing pains and see the problems. And so in the early 1890s, the Australian conferences, because Australia has followed the model of America and has a separate conference for each state, or each separate colony, because then Australia hadn't become an independent nation. What became the states of Australia in 1900 were all separate colonies of Great Britain. But they understood that these were like American states, and so they followed the model. But actually that made sense, because Australia's a vast country. You couldn't have just had one Australian conference. It's too large. And so then you've got the need, as Arthur Daniels and Willie White and Ellen White, who was in Australia in the 1890s, all identify, sometimes we need Australian answers to Australian problems, and we can't refer things back to Battle Creek in Michigan on the other side of the Pacific Ocean.
They still think like that today, which is why they can innovate so much.
Yes, no, that's true. And so they formed the first Union Conference. And then in the late 1890s, the Europeans say, here's a good model, we're in the same situation. We've now got separate conferences across Europe, and we need a European solution. And Ellen White had actually even foreshadowed that when she was in Europe for 2 years in the mid-1880s. She attended a meeting of what was called the European Mission Council and said, yes, this is a good model, but nothing was done to embed it in the organization until after the 1897 General Conference session. And so they formed the European Union Conference. But nowhere else forms unions. So you've still got conferences having to relate directly to the General Conference with no intervening level. One church leader actually says we need something more in the way of organization. Today, if you were to say that, most people would say, no, we don't want more organization, we don't want more bureaucracy. But the aim wasn't to create some kind of notionally perfect organizational structure. It was to create something that was fit for purpose, and that enabled people to be nimble and agile, not wait for weeks or months to get a response from America. So you get these two union conferences formed, but nowhere else. And in the meantime, people are seeing the problems. People are seeing that the church is no longer growing as fast, and the church is having all kinds of financial problems, partly because members have lost confidence in the organized church. They're not being as generous. And also you have a very, very small executive committee. It had a membership of 9. So if you can imagine 9 people deciding the fate of the world church, and because often they were traveling, you could have an executive committee of 5.
And, I had no idea.
And so in effect what you have is a cabal, not a real committee.
Oh, wow.
And this is why Ellen White writes about the General Conference being an example of what she calls kingly power.
She writes around that time?
Exactly. That's what she's referring to.
I see.
And this is often misunderstood, and people will still say, just quote her out of context and apply it to the General Conference today, when we have an executive committee of over 300 with representatives from every part of the world.
Yeah, that's what I'm used to now. Our executive committee is vast, and if you want to get anything done, you need to talk to a lot of people before it happens.
Right. It's like a parliament.
But back then, that's right. 5 people.
But if you can imagine 5 people, and they tended to be the General Conference president and his, for want of a better word, cronies. People, and to be, the General Conference president who was Ola Olson up to 1897, and then George Irwin from 1897 to 1901. To be fair, they're not just power-hungry people. They're wanting to do the right thing by the mission of the church.
Sure.
But they also believe, because this is the way things have been done, they believe this is the Adventist way to do things, and that you can't change without ceasing to be Adventist. And Sam, we've got to step back for a moment. We can return to the 120 years ago in a moment, but that's still a problem for the church today. That attitude that says there's an Adventist way of doing things, and we have to do it in that way, without ever thinking, well, just a minute, if we were starting this for the first time today, is this the way we do things? And, I'm not talking about theology here. I'm not talking about theological change. The church has its 28 fundamentals, and really those have been in place for much longer than the 43 years since they were voted at 1980. Those beliefs have been very stable. We're not talking about beliefs. We're talking about the administrative ways and processes and procedures you have. But there's still that attitude, oh, this is the way we've always done it, so this must be the Adventist way to do things, and therefore if we change, we're not going to be Adventist anymore. That's kind of the unspoken, maybe even unconscious fear that people have. But it does stand in the way sometimes of reforms that could be helpful for the church.
In fact, the very word new and reform, sends people out in allergies that they start scratching themselves. What fascinates me is there is a mantra of innovation, which is you need to fall in love with the problem, not with your solution.
Yeah.
And the problem is, how can we organize ourselves to fulfill the mission God has given us?
Yes.
In 1863, it was one structure that was needed.
Right.
And that helped to establish the sending off the missionary. If we had not done this, the restructuring of 63, or let's say the structuring of 63,
yes,
we would not end up in 74 sending the first missionary.
Absolutely.
And if we had not done the restructuring in 1901, we would not have had the mission explosion even,
right,
of the early 20th century.
And it is an explosion. It really ushers in, 1901 ushers in a golden age of Adventist mission, when the numbers of missionaries greatly increase, church members increase the amount of offerings and tithe that they're giving and tithes that they're returning, because they have confidence that the church is focused on the mission. So we'll talk more about that in this episode and subsequent episodes. But to spoiler alert, it works. It works really, really well. But you do have the problem in the late 1890s that first Olson and then Irwin feel, well, this is the way things are done, so we've got to keep doing it this way. And then they naturally turn to people they trust. And so you do get this tiny, as I say, the full membership of the executive committee is 9, and you rarely get that being present. So you've got just literally a handful of people making decisions for the whole world church. And this is when Ellen White says, no, you've concentrated too much power in too few hands, and there is wisdom in the counsel of many, as Proverbs says.
So let's paint a picture of what's going on in Ellen White's life at this moment, right? Because she is not a spring chicken anymore.
No, far from it.
She is now approaching 80 or around 80, toward that, in my estimation.
Late 70s, yeah.
Right. So you don't have, it's very rare to have an innovator or someone willing to change. You don't pick up new habits when you're old, but she's old.
Yes, early. I misspoke. She's early, but she's past 70 by this time. So she should be set in.
How old was she when she died in 15?
So she was in her mid-80s.
Oh, she was in her mid-80s in 15. Okay, so she's 70-something.
Yes.
Same difference. And now, and to make matters worse, she was involved in the original structuring.
Yes.
Her husband was involved in original structuring.
Was absolutely crucial in the original structuring.
She had every reason to say, this is the Adventist way. God has revealed that it should be this way, and we're not changing.
Absolutely. 100%.
But that's not what happens.
No. Indeed, Ellen White is one of the people who is pushing for change. Initially from Australia, where she is from 1891 to 1900, she and her son W.C. White, or Willie White as he's usually known. William was his first name, but everybody called him Willie, or W.C. in that way that they had of only knowing people through their first initials. So Ellen and Willie White are both in Australia, and she is writing and saying, no, there needs to be a change. We've got to get away from this kingly power. We need to have more people involved in making the decisions, because then you've got a representative body.
How important was it that she was not in Battle Creek when writing this? Because she was feeling the pain in the mission field.
Exactly. And I think that's the key. So when Daniels writes later how it took forever to reach decisions, he's remembering it, but he was there, he experienced it, and she experienced it. She knew very well that it would take weeks or literally months, maybe even more than half a year to get a decision back. And then the question was, who's taken the decision? Is this the best decision from people who actually have never been to Australia
and don't know the context?
Don't know have got no sense of what's going on. So she's there, she sees the problems, and she's aware we need a different level of structure, but also we need to have a more streamlined structure in the way, by not having all these independent associations and societies overlapping and even competing with each other.
So the tension is, we need more centralization, because streamlining something requires a level of centralization, but in a way that creates autonomy for those fields. So those are two different principles. We need maximum autonomy,
yes,
as much as possible, and we need maximum streamlining, which requires centralization.
Yes, it's interesting. Those two principles seem to be at odds with each other, and yet the church works out a modus vivendi that allows it to have both.
So 1901 comes, it's a general conference session. Irwin, the current president, does not want any of this particular, it doesn't want that to change, because he's quite happy to be one of the five.
Yes, he is.
That makes the decisions. He does not continue thereafter, so clearly there was a restructuring. How many people came to general conference sessions? How often did they happen? And do we have any indication for what it was like coming into that general conference session?
That's a great question, and I don't remember the number of delegates by this time, but it would have been approaching 100, I think.
So we don't have thousands.
No. I mean, it's more than the 15 or 20 who would come to the early general conference sessions. Though we know that the sessions were witnessed, and they were very often held in Battle Creek, and we know church members in Battle Creek were looking on. But still, the actual session representatives are very few in number. By the end of the century, it's getting up, but it's certainly nothing like we're talking about today.
And is it annual, biannual?
By that stage, it's biannual. So it's every other year. It had been every year up until 1889, and then it's every other year. And then after 1905, they switched to every 4 years. Because the church is getting bigger, and it's more, when all you have to do is have everybody get on the train and come to Battle Creek, and it takes them a day or two, it's not a problem to meet every year. In fact, they also have several what they call special sessions, which are in between, because it's easy. Once the church has spread to Europe, and then especially to Africa and Australia, that's getting more challenging. So that's why they switched to every 4 years. But at this point, it's every other year. What we know is that many of the delegates arrive wanting to see a change, because we know that one of them writes later, after 1897, everyone was encouraged and thought, the next GC session we're going to see some reform. And then 1899 comes, and it's stasis. The forces of conservatism and reaction say, no, we'll just keep everything the same. So
how was the review at that time creating this discussion? Do we have articles that present both points of view, or
we don't? But
what do we know?
They publish the full transcripts of general conference sessions in the review, not today where they're redacted, and you get a summary, as it were. They publish the full transcript, and so people were aware that there were different points of view. People who read the review, and at this stage the review was still being subscribed to by a fairly significant portion of the membership of the church in North America.
It's what kept us together in many ways.
Yeah, that was particularly true early on, but it's still the case at the end of the century. So people who are reading it are getting the sense, wait, there's more points of view out here, and they're reading people calling for change and calling for reform. So there was a freedom of discussion, and we know that people arrive thinking, well, we were frustrated last time. There's even, we need these reforms even more now. And the key thing is Ellen White is present. She'd come back from Australia to the United States in 1900, and so she attends the 1901 General Conference session, and she gives a worship talk to the assembled leaders the evening before the session opens. And basically, it's a mandate for change. And
I can only imagine what it was like to have Ellen White in a session preaching a sermon before it starts.
Well, and we have a great photo that some of our listeners and viewers will know of Ellen White speaking at the 1901 session, which was in the Dime Tabernacle in Battle Creek. And on the video version, we'll put that photograph up of an actual photo of Ellen White speaking with leaders at the pulpit, with leaders on the platform behind her. It's not of this particular talk, but what she says...
Where is it, this session?
It's in Battle Creek.
In Battle Creek. Okay.
And what she actually says is the whole thing is a mandate for change. It's not one of her most chastising addresses. There are times, she really tears people off a strip. But nevertheless, it's pretty full on. And she actually says, now there must be a change with the General Conference right here in its sitting. We want to know what can be done right here, what can be done right now.
She doesn't give the answers as to what needs to be done.
No.
But it's clear that something must be done.
Yes. And I mean, people often see Ellen White as being, this very 19th century lady, but that could be somebody talking today.
Yeah,
we need change right here, right now.
Yeah.
And so, but you're right. She doesn't say, I have a list of requirements, because she hasn't been given a vision by God about this. She knows things need to change, but she also, she practices what she preaches. There's a representative body here. Let the representative body make the decisions, because there is wisdom in the counsel of many.
And God did not reveal it because the struggle was important.
Yes, for people to realize what was necessary. So Ellen White doesn't say, these are all the things you have to do in detail, but what she does say is, you have to make changes right here. What can be done right here? What can be done right now? And so people are in no doubt that something has to change. And so the next morning, when they convene the session, they actually agree to suspend the normal business and to reconvene as a committee of the whole. Now, this is an ancient parliamentary technique. It was used in the British Parliament. I think it's used at times in the US Congress, but it was certainly used in the British Parliament, by which you can, instead of being the general session, the general meeting, which means you're bound by certain procedures you have to follow. Instead, you say, no, we're creating a committee to look at this, but it's a committee made up of every delegate to the General Conference session. So they form themselves as a committee of the whole, which means they're free to ignore the agenda. They're free to to range very wide.
They're going to brainstorming, essentially.
Yes.
We have this problem. Let's go.
And they elect Arthur Daniels as the chair. Now, Daniels at this stage is only 43. He's been a missionary to New Zealand and Australia. He's been in Australia in the 1890s. He's worked with Ellen and Willie White. He is, Ellen White has been his mentor, really. He is her protege, which probably helps. But at the time, he wasn't expecting this. He was coming back on furlough for leave after having spent nearly 10 years in a foreign country. And he's rather surprised, but he is made but this is the other thing. If you can constitute yourselves as a committee, you can elect your own chairman. You're not bound by who the chairman of the session would normally be, who would be the president or one of his associates.
Was there resistance to this by...
There doesn't seem to have been. And again, we have the full proceedings. Nobody says no.
That shows a great level of humility in a way, because it's like, okay, we need to change.
Well, I think this is why it's important what Ellen White had said
the night before.
Yeah. And so... But there's no sign that Owen says, just a minute, no, that Owen fights tooth and nail to hold on to his position. He accepts that.
Excellent.
As well. He accepts that what Ellen White has said is right, and he's aware of, I'm sure he must be aware of the feeling in favor of change. So they form themselves as a committee of the whole. They elect Daniels as chair, and then they move into saying, right, what needs to be done? And so you get this series of sweeping reforms that could never have been made if they'd followed the normal procedures. But again, it helps that Ellen White is there, and Ellen White speaks at various times through the session. She's not just there, she actually does speak, and that's why we have the photograph of her speaking from the pulpit in the Dime Tabernacle. So what do? They say that unions should be founded everywhere. And so in America, it's interesting actually, all the unions that exist today can trace their origins back to 1901. Because what happens is, during the breaks, during the General Conference session, the different groups go and caucus together, and so the ones from the South form the Southern Union Conference, the ones from the West Coast form the Pacific Union Conference, the ones from the Northern Midwest states form the Northern Union Conference, and so on and so forth. And so actually, they all get formed during this meeting at Battle Creek. So when they say that the Union Conference model should be followed everywhere, people immediately follow through on it and do what they say. They create union conferences. So by the end of it, there are, except for mission fields where there's only, say, one mission, like India, where you've just got the India mission, everywhere there are conferences have been formed into union conferences. And that's important for reasons we'll come back to in future episodes.
Well, let's see how this shift has impacted us. But most importantly, in the next episode, we'll explore the differences between the 1901 restructuring and how that materialized in 1903, because it took a few years for us to get there.
Exactly. So, but they create unions, which means there's the intervening level of structure. And the key thing is, for our listeners who don't understand, a union isn't just a grouping of conferences. It actually has what's called a constituency, which is a group of members. So from 1863 to 1901, who were the members of the General Conference?
Conferences.
They were the conferences. From 1901, the members of the General Conference are the unions. But each union has its own members who are the conferences. So there is what's called a constituency. There's a natural membership who is responsible for electing people. So it's not just that somebody up top has said, right, we're going to group you into this union. No, it's an organic body that has representation, and so the leaders they elect are going to reflect the desires and the dynamics of their member conferences, and in turn the members of the local churches who are the members of the local conferences. The other thing they do, though, of course, is to create departments. They abolish most of the societies and associations, not all, and they convert them into departments. So creating the union conferences achieves the goal of as much autonomy as possible, to use the term you used earlier. The centralization part, which is, again, how can you have these two at the same time, is to say, no, there will be a department, and these departments will be at every level of the church. So it means somebody at the conference level who works in literature evangelism has somebody they can relate to at the union level, who in turn will have somebody he or she can relate to at the General Conference.
And these counterparts are meant to work together.
Exactly.
For maximum efficiency and mission.
Exactly. But they are no longer separate independent corporations. They are actually now departments of the church, and so there is a degree of oversight by the president and the officers, the three officers. The one exception to this was the Foreign Mission Board. And as we touched on last time, the Foreign Mission Board was not just a mission board, it was actually a separate legal corporation, which is kind of bewildering to me, Sam. You know, why would they do that? It's because they're following the model of all the separate associations and societies.
I see. Okay.
But so, as we touched on last time, the Foreign Mission Board is almost, in some ways, in competition with the General Conference. And there's no clear dividing line. There's no clear demarcation. The Foreign Mission Board is responsible for work in some mission areas, but not others. There's a huge amount of confusion and a tendency for people to say, well, the other group will do it.
Is that fixed in 1901 as well?
It was not fixed in 1901. Daniels actually suggests at one point, we don't need to have multiple boards and committees. We could just have one, the General Conference Committee. But people are, at that point, a little reluctant. They want to take their time. They want to think through the implications. That would be my interpretation, because there's no follow-through on that. But on the others, there is. And so now you've got both the devolution of power downward and the concentration of authority in the executive and administrative structure via the departments. So they've managed to achieve the combination of those two principles which seem to be at odds with each other.
Praise the Lord. Well, let's pick up on the next episode what happened in 1903 and how those 2 years of exploration had an effect.
Absolutely.
Thanks for joining us in this episode of Mission 150. Please keep watching on AdventistReview.tv, on the Seventh-day Adventist Church's YouTube channel, or listening on your favorite podcast platform. If you've enjoyed this episode, please share it with your friends. If you want to know more about the Adventist missionary work and missionaries today, go to AdventistMission.org. That's AdventistMission.org. And if you want to find mission opportunities today, go to VividFaith.com. We'll be back next week with more on the inspiring history of Adventist mission around the world.